In this video tutorial, we're going to dissect a couple sentences from Edgar Allan Poe's A Descent into the Maelstrom. Before we start, I want to point out that we are looking at one pattern here that Romantic writers tend to do, which is a word order inversion, or what Cohn and Gray point out is called anastrophe, the Greek term for word order invasion. So let's begin. We're going to look at each sentence that I've pulled. There's just 3 of them, but they're long, so the other 2 are long, so they're complicated. But this first one is a good example of anastrophe. So we're going to follow our rule and look for the verb first. A panorama, more deplorably desolate, no human imagination, can conceive. So the can conceive is our verb. So let's mark that. And I know that that's a transitive verb, because I looked it up just to make sure, and it made sense when I looked at this sentence and tried to dissect it. So let's look to the left of our verb and we'll find our subject. No human imagination, so let's mark that. And if it's a transitive verb, we know that it needs a direct object. What the author has done here is invert the word order so that the direct object starts the sentence. A panorama, more deplorably desolate. A panorama is actually our direct object. And then more deplorably desolate is modifying that direct object, so that's our object complement. So what the sentence really is saying, if it were in its traditional form, would be no human imagination can conceive a panorama more deplorably desolate. By shifting the word order, the emphasis is changed to the panorama and how desolate it is, rather than the first part where the human is conceiving that panorama. So by inverting the word order, the author's really putting an emphasis on the natural landscape and painting a picture for the reader, setting up a tone to the story. Let's look at the next sentence, which is quite long. So we're going to look for our verb first, to the right and the left, as far as the eye could reach. Here's our first verb, reach. And try to figure out what that verb is. It doesn't have anything to the right of it. If we looking at another inversion, as far as the eye could reach, to the right and the left, that makes sense. So let's look at reach, and we know then that because this element that might have been on the right side of the verb was inverted to the beginning of the sentence, it's a prepositional phrase describing where, to the right and to the left. So let's just mark that first before we even mark our verb. And we want to make sure we mark what type of prepositional phrase that is. I could reach. Now we're going to mark our verb as intransitive, as far as the eye could reach, to the right and to the left. Intransitive verb, and to the left of our verb is I. So let's mark that as our subject. And then as far as sort of a hybrid version of a subordinator. So that's our DC. And let's put brackets around that, as far as the eye could reach. And actually that DC really starts at the beginning of the sentence, so I think it would be more accurate to put the bracket here and then mark DC. So let's take this bracket out. Oops. Let's put that as a bracket. Then we're still looking for an IC, otherwise this would be a fragment sentence. So let's continue to look for the next verb. There lay outstretched. So here's our next verb, there lay. And we know that lay, I guess we consider it as a state of being, and that would be a linking verb, lay. And how is it laid? Outstretched. Our subject, complement, adjective. We don't know what it is yet because it's a here-there construction, but we're going to mark our verb as linked and outstretched as our subject, complement, adjective. And then it's immediately followed by a prepositional phrase, the preposition like and the noun ramparts, and then another prepositional phrase of the world before we finally get to the subject, lines. There lay lines of black and beetling cliff. So he's describing the cliff as ramparts, which if you look up the meaning of that word, it almost harkens war, that nature is at war, and we're looking where the frontier or the front lines of that war is, right there at the sea where the storm is brewing. So let's mark this as our prepositional phrase, like ramparts, which is describing how the lines are laying. So since it's a how, that's a prepositional phrase, adverb. And of the world is another prepositional phrase describing ramparts, ramparts of the world. So we're going to call that one an adjective since it's describing a noun. Then we have lines, our subject, and then another prepositional phrase of horridly back and beetling cliff. What a way to describe the shoreline where he's overlooking from high up. Okay, so let's keep going. We're going to look for our next verb, whose character of gloom was, and here it's used as a linking verb, a helping verb, was illustrated. And all of the words before that then are adverbs describing how they were illustrated. So let's mark our verb here, was more forcibly illustrated. And that is a intransitive verb followed by a adverbial by the surf. Prepositional phrase, as so many intransitive verbs are, followed by adverbial prepositional phrases. And then let's go back to the left of that, whose character is our subject. And then to the left of that, whose is our subordinator. So let's underline that. Was but forcibly illustrated. And which reared. Reared is our next verb. And reared also is a transitive verb, actually. It's not an intransitive. Which reared its crest. Crest is our direct object for that transitive verb. This was a tricky one because there's a lot in between describing the crest and this adverbial, really, which is a prepositional phrase, high up against its white and ghastly crest. High up against up high, its white and ghastly crest. So that whole noun here of the direct object has some adjectives describing it. Then finally the sentence ends with howling and shrieking forever, which are both verbals. These are verbs that are turned into a different part of speech. In this case, they are turned into adjectives or participles. And so Poe ends with this nice verbal phrase describing the surf in a sort of almost anthropomorphic way, or personification we would call this in literature, the howling and the shrieking of the waves moving. Notice how that verbal phrase adds movement to what otherwise would just be a plain old adjective, but because it's a verbal adjective, it really has a lot of movement to the description in there.